Sir, before you say another word, explain why you're stopping me in my own yard.
I've already told you someone in this area fits what we were given.
That's not enough. What specifically connects that person
You're refusing to cooperate, and that's becoming a problem.
A problem for who?
You walked up here without a reason, without a name, without a...
The knock on the door wasn't loud, but it carried a pressure that felt wrong from the very first second. A simple afternoon, a quiet street, and a woman who had just finished sorting laundry inside her own home. Nothing dangerous. Nothing suspicious. Nothing worth a badge showing up with that kind of attitude. But the moment she opened the door, she saw the look in the officer's eyes, sharp, impatient, and locked onto her like he had already decided she was guilty of something she didn't even know about. That was the moment everything shifted. That was the moment a normal day became a nightmare she never asked for. Where are you watching from right now? Before we continue, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss stories like this. Seriously, go ahead and subscribe. Now let's continue. She stepped outside onto her porch, still holding a small stack of folded shirts. The officer didn't greet her or explain why he was there. He didn't ask her name or confirm the address. He just stared, sizing her up like a problem he needed to solve. His patrol car was still running at the curb, lights off, door open, like he expected to drag someone back inside it in the next minute. She didn't even know his name yet, but she already understood he wasn't there to ask questions. He was there to take control. That was the kind of energy he carried. Force first, explanation never. He moved closer, boots hitting the concrete with heavy steps, and finally spoke. I need to see your hands. Keep them where I can see them. The demand wasn't loud, but it carried an edge that made her blood heat. She lowered the shirts slowly onto a chair by the door. This is my house, she said. Why are you here? But he ignored the question and repeated the command, word for word, as if she were a threat standing on her own porch doing absolutely nothing. She kept her voice level, asking again what the problem was, why she was being confronted, and whether he had the wrong home. Still nothing. Just cold orders and a stare that refused to soften. His hand hovered near his belt, not fully reaching for anything, but close enough to make his intentions clear. She lifted her hand slightly, not because she was afraid, but because she had been trained to recognize when someone was about to escalate. She held her ground, breathing slow, waiting for him to at least explain. He didn't. Instead, he stepped even closer, close enough that she could see the faint scratch on the clip of his body camera and the tiny reflection of her own face in it. That camera was rolling. She knew it. And she knew this officer had already crossed a line just by approaching the way he did. Then he spoke again. We have a suspect wanted in this neighborhood. You match. That was it. No name. No age. No details. No logic. She stared at him, stunned not by the accusation, but by how lazy it was. Match what? She asked. What description says I'm a suspect? He hesitated, but only for a moment. Female. Medium build. That was all. That was the entire justification for standing on her porch telling her to keep her hands up. She blinked in disbelief. That's not a description, she said. That could be anyone. The tension between them sharpened like a blade being dragged across steel. He didn't like her tone. She saw the shift in his jaw, the stiffening in his shoulders. You need to follow my orders, he said, voice tightening. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't move toward him. She simply repeated that he needed to identify himself, explain the accusation, and tell her exactly what she had supposedly done. The officer took her questions as defiance, even though she hadn't stepped forward or lifted a single finger. She wasn't resisting. She was asking the basic things any citizen has the right to ask when police show up unannounced. But his eyes darkened the longer she spoke, and she could practically see his patience snapping thread by thread. Finally, the moment came, the point where she saw his decision before he even reached for her. He grabbed her wrist, twisting it behind her back in one fast, rough movement. The speed of it was shocking, but the cold metal clicking shut around her wrist was even worse. She didn't scream. She didn't jerk away. She stood perfectly still as the second cuff locked into place. The officer didn't warn her. He didn't tell her she was under arrest. He didn't read any rights. He just cuffed her like she was a criminal he had caught in the middle of some crime she didn't even know existed. She stared at the ground, breathing slow, keeping her fury inside. A neighbor across the street looked up from sweeping his driveway and froze. Another resident paused mid-walk with her dog, eyes wide. Wordless shock spread across the quiet block as people realized what they were watching. A woman arrested on her own porch without a single clear reason. The officer barked at them to keep moving, but no one moved. Every eye on the street was locked on the scene unfolding, disbelief spreading like wildfire. The woman remained silent. She knew arguing now would only give him the excuse he was hungry for. He pulled her toward the patrol car, guiding her with unnecessary force even though she wasn't resisting. Her shirt slipped slightly on her shoulder as he walked her down the steps, but she didn't adjust it. She didn't have free hands, and there were more important things happening than hiding a slip of fabric. The street felt heavier with every step. She heard a teenager whisper, "What did she do?" She heard a mother tell her child to stay back. She heard the officer breathe harder the closer they got to the car, as if he believed he had just made the arrest of the year. She sat in the back seat, cuffs digging into her wrists, staring ahead of the dashboard through the small cage opening. No fear, just focus, just calculation, just the steady realization that the officer standing outside the door had no idea what kind of mistake he had just made. He shut the door, walked around to the driver's side, and slid in without a word. And as the car pulled away from the curb, she closed her eyes, steadying her breath. The situation was already spiraling, but she wasn't done. Not even close. The station smelled like old coffee and disinfectant, a mix that clung to the air and made everything feel colder than it really was. When the patrol car stopped and the officer opened the back door, she stepped out without hesitation. No stumbling. No fear. Just controlled steps and a straight spine. The officer placed his hand on her arm unnecessarily hard, guiding her inside like she was some dangerous suspect. People in the lobby paused mid-conversation as they watched her walk past in cuffs. Some stared because they were curious. Others stared because they already sensed something wasn't right. She kept her eyes forward. She wasn't giving anyone the satisfaction of seeing frustration in her face. Inside the processing area, fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. A desk officer grabbed a clipboard and barely glanced at her before asking for her name. But the arresting officer answered instead, cutting her off before she could speak. That was the first real mistake he made in that building, not allowing her to answer, not even giving her the basic dignity of speaking for herself. The desk officer raised an eyebrow, but said nothing. He'd seen Aryan arrests before. He assumed this was just another one. She let the process unfold. Fingerprints. Photograph. Personal belongings placed inside a plastic tray. When they took her wallet, the first spark of change hit the room. The processing officer lifted her credentials slowly, studying them with a sudden seriousness the arresting officer didn't even notice. She stayed silent, watching his eyes shift from confusion to shock to something close to dread. He looked at the badge, then at her, then at the officer who brought her in. The tension began to thicken, subtle at first, then stronger. The processing officer walked away without saying a word. He moved fast, disappearing into a hallway. She knew exactly what he was doing. Verifying. Confirming. Escalating. The moment he saw her credentials, everything changed. She watched the arresting officer stand there with crossed arms, acting like he had handled things perfectly. He didn't even notice the weight shifting around him. He didn't realize the storm already forming on the other side of that hallway door. Minutes passed. Then the captain walked in, older, calm, but with a seriousness in his eyes that sent a ripple of silence through the room. He looked at her first, then at the cuffs, then at the officer who had put them on. Without raising his voice, he said, "Follow me." The officer looked confused but obeyed. She watched them disappear into an office, the door closing behind them. Inside that office, the shift finally struck. The captain sat down, steepling his fingers, voice low. "Explain exactly why you arrested this woman." The officer started recounting his story, acting like he was describing textbook police work. Same confidence, same dismissiveness. The captain let him talk, but the longer he listened, the more his posture stiffened. When the officer finished, the captain asked one simple question. "Did you even ask her name before arresting her?" Silence. A long, heavy silence that filled every corner of the room. The officer swallowed hard, confidence draining from him, but he still tried to justify himself. "She didn't comply. She questioned me." The captain leaned back, eyes narrowing. "Questioning you is not a crime. Asking for probable cause is not a crime. Standing in her own doorway is not a crime." The words were sharp, unfiltered. A message and a warning all at once. That was the moment the officer finally sensed how much trouble he was in. The captain stood up, picked up the phone, and made the call, the one that would unravel everything. He spoke with someone who clearly outranked everyone in that building. And when he mentioned her name, the voice on the other end practically exploded with urgency. "She needs to be released immediately," the voice demanded. "No charges, no delays, and the chief will be calling you within the hour." The captain's expression drained of color as he thanked the caller and hung up. He stepped out into the hallway. She was sitting in a plastic chair, hands now resting on her lap. No cuffs, posture straight. He approached slowly. "You're free to go," he said quietly. This was a mistake. She looked up at him. Not grateful, not relieved, just steady. "I want copies of everything," she said. "Reports, footage, notes, all of it." The captain nodded instantly. "You'll have them." He didn't argue. He didn't negotiate. He couldn't. But the arresting officer, who had been told to wait in the captain's office, walked out at the wrong moment. He saw her standing, no cuffs, the captain speaking softly, and confusion turned to panic. "Sir, what's going on?" he asked. But the captain didn't answer. Instead, he looked at him with an expression that made the entire room pause. "Go back to my office. Now." The officer hesitated, eyes flicking between them, but the tone left no room to argue. He returned slowly, the door closing behind him. She called someone to pick her up. Her voice was calm, almost emotionless, like she was reading grocery items off a list. No anger, no trembling, no fear, just precision. The kind that comes from knowing exactly what comes next. In the front lobby, a woman waiting for her son saw her walk past and whispered, "What happened to her?" A man sitting nearby leaned forward as if trying to understand how someone like her had been brought in at all. She ignored the stares and kept walking. The captain held the door open for her. That alone told every officer watching that this situation was different. Very different. Outside, the air felt warmer. Cars drove by, unaware of the disaster unfolding inside that building. As she stepped onto the sidewalk, she felt the shift. The moment the situation stopped being an arrest and became a career-ending catastrophe for the man who put cuffs on her. Inside the station, the captain returned to his office. The arresting officer stood there, pale, sweating, waiting for answers. The captain closed the door behind him and said the words that would echo in that officer's mind long after his badge was taken. "You just arrested a federal intelligence officer on her own property without probable cause." The officer's face collapsed into shock. "Sir, I—" The captain raised a hand. "Stop. You're done talking. You're on leave until we finish this investigation. Hand over your badge and your weapon." The officer froze, jaw trembling. But the captain didn't soften. "This is serious. You didn't just make a mistake. You violated protocol, escalated without reason, and ignored every safeguard we have. Back outside, she waited on a bench, breathing calmly as her ride approached. A car pulled up, and she got inside without looking back. She didn't need to. She already knew what would happen next. Calls would be made. Meetings would be scheduled. Reports would be demanded. And the officer who thought he had everything under control would soon learn just how big of a mistake he had made. This wasn't over. Not even close. By the next morning, the story was no longer just a mistake. It was a crisis rolling downhill with no brakes. Before sunrise, 3 different offices had already exchanged urgent calls. The chief knew. The mayor knew. The city attorney knew. And every single one of them understood the same thing. This wasn't a small issue that could be smoothed over. This was a disaster that would cost the city a fortune and shake the department from the inside out. All because one officer refused to slow down long enough to follow basic procedure. Back at her home, she stood in her living room typing every detail she remembered into a document. Timestamps. Words said. Tone used. Pressure on her wrist when the cuffs clicked. The exact moment the officer grabbed her without warning. She wasn't writing emotionally. She wasn't writing dramatically. She was writing with the precision of someone trained to record events that carry consequences. She knew none of this would be forgotten, so she made sure every detail was clean and exact. Her phone buzzed multiple times with messages from coworkers checking on her, but she ignored them. She needed her mind clear. Across town, the officer responsible for all this sat on his couch, badge gone, weapon gone, suspension notice sitting on a table like a warning label. He stared at it, stunned that everything he built over 6 years had crumbled in less than one afternoon. He replayed the arrest in his head, but every time he reached the moment where he forced her wrists behind her back, his stomach twisted. He told himself he did nothing wrong. He told himself she was suspicious. He told himself anyone would have done the same. But the more he tried convincing himself, the more the doubt crawled up his throat. At the station, Internal Affairs began gathering evidence. Body cam footage, dispatch logs, witness reports from neighbors. They interviewed officers who had worked with him before. Quietly, patterns started emerging, too many stops that led nowhere, too many complaints dismissed without proper review, too many people describing the same uneasy feeling when interacting with him. For the first time, the department took a hard look at the behavior they had ignored for years. Back at her place, she finished her documentation, saved the file, and forwarded it to her attorney. He read every line with growing tension. When he called her, he didn't waste time. This case is strong, very strong. They're going to want to settle. Her voice remained steady. I don't want a quick apology. I want accountability. He understood exactly what she meant. Money wasn't the point. Change was. By noon, her attorney filed the federal civil rights lawsuit. It hit the city like a punch to the gut. Claims of unlawful arrest. Claims of racial profiling. Claims of violation of constitutional rights. Every piece was backed by evidence. And because she wasn't just any citizen, because she held a federal intelligence position with a clean record, her credibility was ironclad. The city attorney read through the filing and closed the folder slowly, realizing the truth. This was unwinnable. Meanwhile, the officer arrived for his mandatory interview with Internal Affairs. He sat across from 2 investigators who had already reviewed hours of footage. They didn't look hostile. They didn't look angry. They simply looked done with excuses. One investigator asked him, "At what point during the encounter did she become a threat?" He stuttered, unable to answer. Another investigator leaned forward. What specific detail in the description matched her? The silence stretched so long, it became more incriminating than any confession could have been. The investigators weren't interested in feelings. They were interested in facts. And the facts showed he had acted on assumptions, not evidence. They paused the footage multiple times, pointing out things he ignored. Her calm posture, her repeated requests for explanation, her standing on her own property with no signs of wrongdoing. The officer looked at the screen, watching himself bark commands at a woman watering plants. The more the footage played, the smaller he felt. At her home, her attorney called again. They're asking for a meeting. They want to discuss settlement terms. She didn't smile. She simply nodded and said, "Good. Let's hear what they have to say." The city moved fast. They knew delay would only make everything worse. A conference room was prepared. Officials from the city attorney's office, representatives from the police department, and her attorney all sat around the table. She walked in calmly, wearing simple clothes, nothing flashy. When she sat down, the room seemed to shift, as if everyone finally understood exactly who had been wronged. The negotiations began quietly. The city started with an apology. She didn't interrupt. Then they moved to the settlement amount, high six figures. Higher than most cases ever reached. But she didn't react. She listened, hands folded, expression unreadable. When they finished, her attorney leaned toward her and whispered, "They're offering a strong deal." She nodded once and said aloud, "I accept. With conditions." The room stilled. She continued, "I want mandatory training added. I want stronger review protocols. And I want the department to implement checks that prevent vague descriptions from being used as cause for detention." No one argued. No one even hesitated. They agreed immediately because they knew refusing would destroy them publicly. The paperwork was signed, the settlement sealed, and the chapter of negotiations closed with finality. But the aftermath was just beginning. The officer received a call that afternoon. He was terminated effective immediately. Policy violations, procedural failures, pattern of misconduct. The letter didn't sugarcoat anything. He stared at it for a long time, feeling the weight of a career that ended not because of bad luck, but because of choices he refused to own. He packed his belongings into a box and left the station through the back door, avoiding the eyes of the officers who had already heard the news. Training programs were revised. Supervisors were given new responsibilities. Body cam footage reviews became more frequent. And the department, for the first time in years, took a hard look at bias that had gone unchecked for too long. As for her, she returned to work the following week. Her coworkers greeted her quietly, respectfully. No one treated her like a victim. They treated her like someone who faced a system built to break people and refused to be broken. She sat at her desk, opened a new classified report, and went right back to doing the job she had always done, protecting the country with precision and discipline. She never spoke publicly about what happened. Not because she was afraid, but because the outcome spoke louder than any interview could. The changes, the settlement, the firing, those were her statements. The officer moved to another state and took a job in private security, staring at camera monitors instead of wearing a badge. When he told the story, he blamed politics. He blamed the system. He blamed anything except his own actions. But the record didn't change. The footage didn't change. The consequences didn't change. And the truth stayed the same. A vague description, a rushed assumption, and a refusal to listen cost him his career. She didn't win because she yelled. She didn't win because she fought. She won because the facts were undeniable, the footage was undeniable, and the law, when applied correctly, was on her side. The incident lasted less than 2 hours. The impact lasted far longer. And the lesson was simple. Power without discipline destroys itself.